Ever thought about getting valuable stuff out of the ground without, digging a massive hole?
Now that would be a neat trick.
Well, that's what we're diving into today. Uranium In-Situ recovery, or ISR for short.
Sounds intriguing already.
You sent over a whole stack of technical documents on it, so we're going to break it down, find the good stuff.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so imagine this. Getting your hands on those valuable minerals, but without those giant open pit mines. You know the ones, those massive holes in the ground.
Yeah, those images definitely stick with you.
Totally. This ISR thing is different. It's more like, I don't know, precision extraction.
It's a much more targeted approach, that's for sure. Less brute force, more finesse.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, it's not some newfangled idea either. These documents call ISR a proven technology. And get this, they say it's responsible for almost half the world's uranium production.
Wow, half! That's a lot bigger than I would have guessed.
Right. So how does this ISR thing even work?
All right, so picture this. They inject a special liquid, it's called a lixiviant, directly into the uranium-rich rock layers underground.
Okay, so they're sending stuff down there.
Yeah. And here's the cool part. That lixiviant is designed to dissolve the uranium, allowing them to basically pump it back up to the surface.
No massive trucks hauling rocks around.
Nope, it's all about that liquid extraction.
That's pretty wild. But uranium isn't just scattered evenly throughout the ground, right?
So right, it tends to collect in very specific geological formations, primarily permeable sandstone.
Sandstone, like what you find at the beach.
Well, similar idea, but deeper underground. Think of sandstone with a bunch of tiny interconnected spaces, perfect for that lixiviant to flow through.
So it's kind of like a natural sponge holding the uranium, and they're using this lixiviant to sort of wash it out.
That's a great way to think about it. And to actually extract the uranium from that sandstone, it involves a bit of chemical magic. It all comes down to something called redox reactions.
Redox reactions. Okay, you might have to break that down for me a little bit. Chemistry isn't exactly my forte.
Sure, so think of it like a game of tug of war, but between elements. And this tug of war determines whether the uranium is in a soluble or insoluble state.
Soluble meaning it dissolves, right?
Yeah. And by carefully controlling the chemistry of that lixiviant they inject, they can ensure that the uranium is in that dissolvable form ready to be pumped back up.
That's really neat. But how do they even find these uranium deposits in the first place? Are we talking like dowsing rods here?
Not quite. They actually use some seriously high-tech methods. One of the main ones is aerial radiometric surveys.
Aerial, so like from the air.
Exactly. They fly planes or helicopters equipped with special detectors that can measure the naturally occurring radiation from the uranium deposits.
Wow, so they can pinpoint it from above ground?
Yep. But they don't stop there. They also analyze groundwater samples. And get this, they even use a technique called prompt fission neutron logging.
Okay, that one sounds pretty intense.
It is. They're essentially using the science of nuclear physics to pinpoint those uranium deposits deep underground.
Now that's what I call next level detection. So say they've located a promising uranium deposit and they've got their lixiviant ready. What's the next step? They just start pumping it down there.
Well, not quite. First, they need to create a network of wells to inject that lixiviant and then extract the uranium-rich solution. These are called well fields, and they're designed in very specific patterns to maximize efficiency.
Like a whole grid of wells. I actually read about that, the 5-spot and 7-spot patterns. It sounds kind of like a choreographed dance of injection and extraction.
That's a good way to put it. There's definitely a science to the placement. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Depending on where you are in the world, what happens to the groundwater after extraction can be a big deal.
Oh, so the environmental impact is a major consideration.
Absolutely. For example, in areas with freshwater aquifers, like in parts of the U.S., restoring that groundwater to its original quality is a top priority. But in places like Kazakhstan or Australia, where the groundwater is already pretty salty, the focus on restoration isn't quite as high.
So the approach to ISR can vary quite a bit, depending on the local environmental factors.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. But going back to those well fields for a minute, I remember seeing something in the documents about different types of lixiviants, something about acidic and alkaline. What's the deal with that?
Ah, yes, that's a crucial aspect of ISR. Choosing the right lixiviant is super important, and it all comes down to the specific geology of that uranium deposit.
So different recipes for different deposits. If the rock contains a lot of calcium carbonate, for example, they'll likely use an alkaline lixiviant. But if not, an acidic solution might be the way to go. It all comes down to finding that sweet spot, maximizing the dissolution of the uranium while minimizing any unwanted side reactions.
It's fascinating how much chemistry is involved in this whole process. So they've found their uranium, picked the right lixiviant, carefully designed their well field. What happens next in this intricate dance of extraction?
Well, they've got to get that lixiviant down into the earth and that uranium-rich solution back up, and that's where the real action begins.
So they got those pipes in the ground,
Yeah.
the wells, and they're pumping that lixiviant down to get the uranium.
Exactly. And that solution, now containing that dissolved uranium, makes its way back up to the surface to a processing plant.
They don't just like scoop it out with a bucket, right?
Right. Not quite. They use a technique called ion exchange to separate the uranium from all that water.
An ion exchange. So is that kind of like using a giant magnet to pluck out the uranium?
You're on the right track. It's like a highly specialized magnet designed to attract only those uranium atoms.
So they're basically pulling out the uranium from the water, leaving all the other stuff behind.
Precisely. And what you're left with is a concentrated form of uranium known as yellowcake.
Yellowcake, it sounds so harmless, like something you'd bake in the oven.
It's a bit deceiving, right? But yeah, that yellowcake is ultimately destined for nuclear reactors and other applications.
The whole process just blows my mind. But we can't forget about all that water they use for extraction, right? What happens to that?
That's an important consideration. Of course, they can't just let it go back into the environment as is, so they have a few options.
I'm just like, what?
Well, ideally, they aim to purify the water enough so it can be safely returned to the environment. That's always the goal.
So it's like they borrow the water for a bit and then give it back, good as new.
That's the idea, but sometimes, depending on the specific conditions and regulations, they might need to dispose of it in other ways.
Like, what would that look like?
There are things like deep disposal wells where they inject the water deep underground into isolated formations.
So kind of like putting it back where it came from, just much deeper down.
Yeah, that's one approach. They also sometimes use evaporation ponds where the water naturally evaporates over time, leaving behind any remaining minerals.
Evaporation ponds, huh? I bet those are closely monitored to make sure nothing funky is going on.
You bet those ponds are carefully designed and managed to minimize any potential environmental impact.
Makes sense. So we've talked about the lixiviant, the wells, the extraction, but I'm so curious about how they make sure that lixiviant only goes where it's supposed to, underground.
Ah, good question. They use specific well completion methods to control the flow of that lixiviant.
Well, completion methods, so they don't just drill a hole and call it a day.
Definitely not. It's much more involved than that. They might, for example, perforate the well casing at very specific depths.
Perforate, so like poke holes in it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those holes allow the lixiviant to flow out into the targeted zones of the uranium deposit.
And they can control where those holes are.
Precisely. They can position those perforations very precisely to ensure the lixiviant is going exactly where it needs to go.
That's some serious precision work. It's like underground surgery.
It's a very apt comparison. They use specialized tools and techniques to make sure everything is positioned just right.
So once they've got the wells drilled and prepped, they just flip the switch and start pumping that lixiviant.
Well, not quite yet. Each well undergoes rigorous testing before it's given the green light.
What kind of testing?
One of the most important is a mechanical integrity test. They basically want to make sure there are absolutely no leaks in that well casing.
So they're making sure that lixiviant can't escape into any unwanted areas.
Exactly. They'll seal the well, pump it full of water, and then carefully monitor the pressure. If there's any drop in pressure, it means there's a leak somewhere and they have to go back and fix it.
Sounds like a pretty nerve-wracking test.
It's a crucial one. They want to be absolutely certain that those wells are leak-proof before they start injecting any lixiviant.
Makes sense, especially with something as sensitive as uranium. So once those wells pass inspection, the real action begins.
Exactly. That's when they start pumping. And remember those well field patterns we talked about, the 5-spot, 7-spot?
Yeah, like a carefully choreographed dance of injection and extraction.
Precisely. They have to carefully balance the flow rates between all those wells, making sure that lixiviant is moving efficiently through the ore zone without spreading too far.
So they're constantly monitoring and adjusting the flow.
Absolutely. They use sophisticated computer systems and sensors to keep tabs on everything in real time.
It's like they're conducting an orchestra of lixiviant.
It's a very delicate balancing act requiring constant attention and adjustment to make sure everything is working in harmony.
This whole process is just incredible. But let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about all the technical details of ISR, but I'm curious, why is this method so important in the grand scheme of things?
That's a great question, and it boils down to this compared to traditional mining, which often leaves a large environmental footprint. ISR offers a potentially much cleaner and more sustainable way to extract uranium.
So it's not just about getting the uranium, it's about minimizing the impact on the surrounding environment, right?
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between resource extraction and environmental responsibility.
Which is huge these days, especially with all the talk about sustainability and reducing our impact.
Absolutely. And as the demand for clean energy sources like nuclear power continues to grow, finding sustainable ways to extract uranium becomes even more crucial.
That makes sense, but knowing how efficient and potentially less impactful ISR can be, why isn't it used even more widely? I mean, if it's so great, what's the catch?
That's a really good question, and there are a few key factors at play. First off, not all uranium deposits are suitable for ISR.
Oh, really? So it's not a magic bullet solution for every uranium deposit out there.
Unfortunately not. It requires those specific geological conditions we talked about earlier, that permeable sandstone that allows the lixiviant to flow through easily.
Right, like that natural sponge analogy we talked about.
Exactly. If the geology isn't right, if the rock is too dense or impermeable, ISR simply won't work effectively.
So that rules out a good chunk of potential uranium deposits right there.
It does, and even with ideal geology, there are still economic factors to consider.
Like,
Well, for starters, ISR requires a significant upfront investment. Those well fields, those processing plants, they don't come cheap.
so it's a risky investment for mining companies.
It can be. They need to be confident that they'll be able to recover enough uranium to make that investment worthwhile.
It's like they're trying to calculate the odds of finding a big enough pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Exactly. And we can't forget about public perception either.
That's a big one these days.
It really is. Uranium mining, regardless of the method, often faces opposition from communities who are understandably concerned about potential environmental risks.
People have heard those stories about mining disasters and contamination.
And it's important to acknowledge those concerns. Transparency and responsible practices are absolutely crucial for building trust with communities and demonstrating that ISR can be done safely and sustainably.
It sounds like ISR has the potential to really change the conversation around uranium mining, showing that it can be done in a way that's much more environmentally friendly.
It definitely does. And as technology continues to advance, we can expect even more innovation in ISR, making it even more efficient, even more targeted, and even less impactful on the environment.
It's pretty amazing to think about all the possibilities. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to a whole new world of mining. I have to admit, I didn't know much about ISR before we started this conversation.
It's a fascinating field for sure, and it really highlights how technology and innovation are playing a crucial role in helping us meet our energy needs while minimizing our footprint on the planet.
Well said. But before we wrap up this deep dive into the world of ISR, I have to ask you the question we always leave our listeners with something to ponder as they go about their day.
I'm ready. Hit me with it.
We've been laser focused on uranium today. But this ISR technique, this idea of selectively extracting what we need while leaving the rest undisturbed, could it be applied to other resources as well? Could this be a key to a more sustainable future for mining in general?
Well, that's a question worth pondering. It really makes you appreciate the power of innovation and how we might be able to reshape industries in a more sustainable way. It's something to think about for sure.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into uranium in situ recovery. Thanks for joining us as we explored this fascinating and incredibly complex process.
It was my pleasure. Always glad to dig into these topics and uncover the hidden wonders happening right beneath our feet.